Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar under the naming New Features in the version 9.4. Now this is the fifth webinar and the last one in this series, and today we will talk about how to work with the user permissions, the new user permissions that have been added in 9.4. We will look at how to use it and how to set it up. I'm your speaker of today, and all what I will show and explain will be within the PIM area of our Dynamicweb all-in-one platform. Now the new user management or the new user permissions system in 9.4 are also working in our content and marketing and all other places in our platform, but I will today just be focusing on how to use the permission system in the PIM area. Now the agenda for today is why do we need a user permissions? And how does it work seen from a user perspective? How can we set up user groups with the default permissions? How can we control user access to the modules and structures? And how can we control user access to the specific language? The estimated time for this session is 20 minutes, so let's go on. So first, why do we need user permissions? Now, as you all know, when you look into a company's organizations or the way they are working on, they have typically different roles or different departments that are responsible for different areas. Again, I'll be focusing on the PIM area, but of course this user permissions can be used for the content and the e-commerce and other things in the Dynamicweb system. Now if we are focusing on the PIM area, there will typically be persons in the company that are responsible for the technical enrichment. There will maybe be some people responsible for the marketing stuff, the marketing text. There may be brand managers that are responsible for handling the product of a specific brand, or maybe the product into a specific country areas or language areas. So all these things should be possible to set up in the permission system. Another way of looking at handling with permissions is maybe to limit the user's access to products. They have to be enriched. And you could do that on the process-oriented access. So instead of have access to all the products, you maybe only have access to product in a certain state in the workflow. And as soon as you have done your work on the products in that state, it continues to the next state in the workflow and disappear from that user's working area. So again, setup of permissions can be done in different ways and will typically be individual for company to company because they are working different and they are working different with their products, and of course there are different type of products and need different attention from the users. So that's why companies need user permissions system to handle all these setups and ways and work with products. Now let's look at these permissions from a user perspective. If we look at user rights, if you log in as an administrator, well, typically an administrator have access to all areas, all settings, all stuff in your platform. So there, of course, you have a lot of modules. In this case, it's our standard modules list. You have access to settings, so you can set system parameters and so on. So typically for an administration login, there are no restrictions. If we then take a look at login as a technical person, I mean a person that are responsible for enrich technical informations on, in my case, bikes, you can then see there are restrictions on the modules basically I'm limited to only have access to my PIM module. I still have my home in the top, but I only have access to my PIM module. And if I go inside my PIM module, you will see that I have only access to 2 warehouses. If I just jump back, you maybe saw that as an administrator, I have 3 warehouses defined in my system. So as a technical person, I only have access to the PIM bikes and equipment warehouse and the PIM warehouse too. But also inside the warehouse, you can see that I have only access to the bike category group and the components category group. If I again jump back to the administrator, you can see I do also have a category group called clothing and accessories. So again, as a technical person that are responsible for enriched products with bikes and components for bikes, I only need access to these 2 category groups. Another thing you have to look at is up in the top here. You can see I have only access to the English language. Again, if I jump back to the administrator, you can see I have 12 languages set up in my system. But because of the way I've set up this demo system, I only allow the technical person to enrich technical stuff on the default language. Now if we switch to another role groups or person groups, that could be the marketing person. First of all, we still have a restriction on our module, access to the modules, but as a marketing person, I need of course to have access to all the PIM areas, but I also have access to my content. That means I can make changes to articles on my website. I maybe have access to files, to users, to e-commerce, and to the marketing module, because it's useful for this type of users to have access to these areas. At the same time, you can see in my PIM structure, the marketing users have access to clothing and accessories, because a marketing user are typically responsible for translation the marketing text into the different languages. So of course they need to have access both to the bikes and also for clothing and accessories. And if you go further up to this area with our languages, you can see the marketing user have access to almost all languages. There are only 1 language they're missing, but again, because the marketing person are responsible for all the translations for the different languages, they need access to all of them. So that was just an example of what is the difference from the administrator for a technical user that are responsible for bikes and for the marketing user in my setup. Now let's take a look in a real life. I log into the system. I have already logged in, and you can see I go to my PIM module and I can see all the structures, all 3 warehouses. I have my bikes down here, and if I go into one of them, you can see I have these languages, access to these languages. Now if I switch to another browser and log in as a technical person, there you can see I only have access to my PIM module, and within there I have access to 2 warehouses and only the 2 category groups. And if I go down to my mountain bikes, you see that I'm only allowed to look at the English and make enrichment on the English language, because all my fields for the equipment I have to fill out are automatically enriched or inherit to my other languages, so it's not necessary to have access to all the other languages. Of course, if you want them allow the users to have access to them, you can set that up as well, of course. So this is the setup I have done for my technical person that are responsible for bikes. If I sign out, log in as the marketing person, you immediately see that I have access to more modules. I have access to the e-commerce, to my content area, the front page, and of course the PIM area as I shown in the PowerPoint. And if I take the same product, I of course have access to much more languages because I'm responsible for translating the different languages to the different languages. So that's how it's looked like. But how do we then set this up? Now, if I take a look into it, this is the new user permissions. So if you just start and install Dynamicweb solutions, it will typically be running on the old version of the permissions. So you have to go to your settings, your user areas or the control panel and the user areas and click off this permissions checkbox. Other than you're not using the new permissions system. Now when you have done that, you can then start to look at your user groups and maybe define different user groups. That could be that you need to have a group of users that have the marketing rights. You maybe have a group of users with the product manager rights and maybe brand manager rights and so on and so on. So you have to analyze and find out how is the company's organization, how is their roles, and how can you split up the roles within the organization. So what we can set on the group is that we can set a default permissions. That means that will be the permissions all users within that group will automatically have. So you can set them with different levels. Can be read or maybe all rights. Now, how and what you should select as default permissions is really depending on what should the users within that group be allowed to. Now, if you take a look at the marketing group I showed before, they have access to most of the system. It's basically only the settings and the setup and the more technical part they are not allowed to have access to. So therefore, I will set up a marketing group with an edit or maybe all permission, because they nearly have rights to make changes and create things within all the area of the system. If you then take another area, and that could be a technical user that should only be looking at a specific small area, maybe within PIM and maybe just one language, then I will set it to none, because then it's easier to set up the right permissions in the whole structure, because if you start with none, you have no rights to anything. And then it's easier to open up for the areas and rights you can have in these specific areas. Now, not so much talk. Let's try to make a user and a user group. So what I'll do now is I will very quickly go in. I have created a user with the non-permissions. I will make the following things available for the user. I will give the user access to the PIM warehouse where the clothing area are placed. I'll give access to the PIM shared queries, so they can use these shared queries that are across the organization. And I will add the Danish language to the user group. English is default. So I sign up with this one. I'll switch to my administration part. I'll go to my user area. And as mentioned, I have already made the group called PIM Clothing. So that means this is people that are responsible for enrich the technical part of the clothing area or the products in the clothing area. Now, if I take a look at this group, you can see I have set my default permissions to none. Now, let me try to log in with this user. So PIM Clothing. is empty because I have set my default to be none. That means I have no access to anything. Now let's follow what we described in the PowerPoint. We'll give access to the PIM warehouses where the clothing area are placed, access to the queries, and access to the Danish language. Go back to my administration part, go to my PIM module. I'm an administrator now. Right click, permissions. You can see my PIM clothing. The inherent permissions are none. I add my group, PIM clothing, selected, all, save. I do the same with my warehouses, permissions. Again, my clothing is none. I add clothing. I say all, save. And I do it on my shared queries, permissions, add the group, PIM clothing, all, save. Now let's switch back to the user where I have this empty screen or clear screen. I make an update, just press F5. Whoopsie, you see I have my access to the PIM module. If I press on it, you see that I have access to the warehouses and I have access to my shared queries. If I click on my shared queries, maybe take this Product Manager for clothing, I have access to this query and I can see the stuff in there. I can click on a product and again I only have access to my default language. So quite easy, quite fast to set up. Now we're still missing one thing. We need to add the Danish language. I go back to my administration login, go to my settings, into e-commerce, international languages, click on my Danish language, go to my permissions. You can see clothing, none. I add the group, add my clothing, and say all, and save. Go back to my login with PIM clothing, make an update, press F5, go into the area again, show my clothing, there we are. Now I have my Danish language. As you can see, quite easy to maintain and handle, but of course it's important that you set up your defaults so it's fit into the way the company are organized and the roles they have within maintain and enrich the products. So let's go back to the PowerPoint again. This was the fast and quick way of setting up this group or the user in that group. So basically, what did I do? Well, first of all, I went to my module list as an administrator. I right-click on it, and I decided that I allow the users or the user group to have access to that particular module. Just by, if you look at the screen here, you can say what you have in the bottom half of the pop-up window is what they are inherent to this level, and inherent is of course also the default set on the group. So if you want to make direction to the default or derivate from the default, you will then add the group to the upper half of this pop-up window, and you set what permissions or role the users group should have on this level. If you then want to make changes or permissions within the structure below the module, you can then go to the point where you want to make a difference. In this case, I have below a warehouse, something called usual networks and country informations, and then European area. Well, that could be that you can have access to the European area if you're one of the countries or logins from the Europe, or you can have a US area or maybe a Pacific area, and so on and so on. So you just go in, and in this case, Germany and Denmark, you can see down here, have read access, and basically US has also read access as default. But because this is the European area, then I add my US group and say there are no access for users within the US group. So basically, I lock the door into that group, or into that category group. Well, the same thing with the languages, as you saw in my fast live demo. I went into my language list of languages that are defined on the system. I clicked on the Danish one. Again, my inherit permissions are coming from my default or what have been specified higher in the hierarchy. And then I add the group I want to make, I want to direct from my inherit permission, set the permissions I want, and save and close. And that's it. So, permissions can be difficult. It could be very complex depending on the company and the company ways of working with things. But as you can see, the technician and the setup have a lot of possibilities and a lot of differences depending on how you use it. So that's what I have to say about the permissions. If you want to know more, you can go into our website and read about it. You can go into the webinar and see this recording from this webinar. Of course, the doc site you can go into. And that was the last session in this of these 5. So hope you have enjoyed it and have a nice day.